To understand the events of 1967, I have to take you back to 1966. Lyndon Johnson was president, and I was 17 years old and attending Taft, a New England all boys boarding school located in Watertown, Connecticut. Now, back in the day, New England boarding schools were strict places with a whole range of rules and regulations that regulated the student's life from the time he got up in the morning until the time he went to bed at night. Now, notice I said he. At that time, the boarding schools were not coeducational. That was a revolution that was still a handful of years in the future. If you want an idea of what went on at an all boys boarding school, read A Separate Piece or watch the Dead Poets Society. Or for a UK version, check out any of the Goodbye Mr. Chips movies. American prep schools were modeled after their British Eton-like counterparts. But this isn't a reflection about prep schools. It only starts there. Actually, it started back in the late 1930s, early 40s, when my father learned to play the trombone and got a job playing with a swing band in a roadhouse down in Rehoboth Beach, Delaware. In the summer of 1966, I found my father's old trombone and decided to take lessons. Now, prep schools being prep schools, my wish to emulate my father was immediately embraced by the faculty, and Mr. Young was assigned as my trombone teacher. Phil Young was a great guy, well over 6 feet tall, with close-cropped blonde hair. He taught music, coached football, and was the associated conductor of the Waterbury Symphony Orchestra in Waterbury, Connecticut, just a few towns over from us, a short ride of 15 minutes or so. I liked the man. He put up with my limited musical talent and let me come to my own realization that playing the trombone was, well, not in my blood. In fact, I liked the man enough that I took a permission to go and see him conduct the second half of a symphony presentation one pleasant fall evening. Now, at that time, when you were in a boarding school, you were literally in that school. To leave the school for any reason except for walking to the designated shopping areas along the main street of Watertown, Connecticut, you needed a signed permission slip. Now, every student was given 3 one-day permissions and 1 overnight permission per semester. They were something you guarded with religious devotion. A day permission could get you as far as New York City. Trains left the Waterbury train station on a very convenient schedule. With an overnight permission, you could leave school on Saturday after classes. Yeah, we had classes on Monday through Saturday, and not have to be back until bed check on Sunday night. Now, my parents were supporters of the Waterbury Symphony Orchestra and good friends with the musical conductor Sayers Stone. On this particular evening, the symphony was going to be performing with Jose Greco, the world-renowned flamenco dancer. Now, for those of you too young to remember who Jose Greco was, at that time he was the most requested performer on the Ed Sullivan Show. For those of you too young to remember the Ed Sullivan Show, it was the premier venue for variety artists on TV during the golden age of television. When the Fab Four, the Beatles, made their first U.S. appearance, it was on the Ed Sullivan Show. When Elvis Presley, the King, made his world debut, it was on the Ed Sullivan Show. Ed Sullivan could make or break you as a performer. And when people wrote to him requesting to see someone, Jose Greco was the first person on their list. Now, Gail offered to introduce my parents to Jose, and they wondered if I'd be interested in going along with them. Now, with Phil conducting the second half of the program, I figured, why not? It would be killing 2 birds with 1 stone. I would get to meet a famous person and make brownie points with one of the school's masters. Back in 1956, Jose made Around the World in 80 Days for Michael Todd. Michael Todd was married to Elizabeth Taylor, and the two of them were Hollywood's premier power couple. Now, after the shooting of the movie, Mike Todd gave everyone a parting gift. Jose's gift was a blue terry cloth bathrobe with the Around the World in 80 Days logo stitched into the breast pocket. Jose carried that robe with him on tour everywhere. Once, he left it behind, and he literally got off the plane to go back and get it. Fortunately for him, he did, because that plane crashed, killing everyone on board. For Jose, that blue terry cloth bathrobe was his good luck talisman. Superstitiously, he never got into makeup unless that robe was draped across his shoulders. But on that particular night in Waterbury, Connecticut, with a green full of people — by the way, the performance was outside on the main green in the center of town, with a special stage set up to accommodate the symphony and Jose's dance troupe — Jose lost it. Really lost it. In more ways than one, he lost his bathrobe, and because of that, he had a classic diva hissy fit and refused to perform. The green was mobbed. The only two times I had ever seen more people, or as many people, on the green in Waterbury, Connecticut was one for John Fitzgerald Kennedy when he made a campaign stop there before his election, and two for President Ronald Reagan when he stopped there to give a speech. So this was throng of humanity was milling about. I separated myself from my parents and went backstage to wish Phil luck with his portion of the show. Backstage was in an uproar. Jose had locked himself in his dressing room and was refusing to come out. I found Phil and asked him what was wrong. He told me that Jose had lost his good luck bathrobe and was refusing to perform. I asked him what the robe looked like. Phil had never seen it. He just was told that it was some kind of blue terry cloth thing. Well, on my way into the backstage, I passed a row of garbage cans, and I remembered seeing the corner of something blue sticking out of one of them. So I went back to check. Sure enough, it was a ratty, old, beat-up terry cloth bathrobe. I brought it back inside and gave it to the first stagehand I saw. He immediately ran off with it, and I went to find Phil. Again, only I hadn't taken more than a few steps when I heard this voice shouting at me, "That young man there, bring him to me." Before I knew what was happening, I was swept along and ushered into a small dressing room. When the door closed behind me, I found myself standing in front of a gaunt, pale-skinned man with receding hairline, a hawk-like nose, and dressed only in a white tank-top t-shirt, green boxer shorts, black socks with garters, and lovingly cradling that old bathrobe as if it were his favorite kitten. He started talking about Mike Todd and Elizabeth Taylor and the trouble they had getting the sound of his boots striking the table on which he was dancing. It was Jose Greco, the Jose Greco, standing in front of me in his underwear. I honestly couldn't tell you which shocked me more, that he wore boxers or that he wore garters. But then he did something that totally fascinated me. He whipped the blue terry cloth bathrobe around his shoulders, turned to the mirror, and began to make up. While he told me the story of the bathrobe, he picked up a tin of clown white and whited out his whole face from his hairline to where his neck met his torso. Once he was kabuki white, he drew in a hairline, painted his scalp black, and then he took that same black and with a brush drew in lines around his mouth, nose, cheekbones. He also lined the sides of his throat. Then he began to apply layers of flesh tone colors until within a few minutes of my having been ushered into that room, he had transformed himself from a skinny little Italian guy from Brooklyn, New York, into the living poster of Jose Greco, complete with the tight Andalusian pants and vest and the castanets. "Well, how do I look?" he asked. "Ready when you are, Mr. DeMille," I said, hoping that he would catch the movie reference. He did and laughed. "You know," I said, "I'm supposed to meet with you after the show." I told him of Mr. Stone's offer. "Great, see you then," he said. Now, I hurried back to my folks, but never got the chance to tell them what had happened because of the delay for the lost bathrobe. Once Jose was ready, the show immediately went on, and I took my seat. Jose performed. Sayard Stone conducted Mozart's overture to Don Giovanni and Beethoven's Seventh in A minor. There was an intermission. It came and went, and I still hadn't had a chance to say a word. Phil conducted some works by Schubert, and then the show was over. My parents, myself, and several other symphony supporters went backstage and waited in an inconspicuous area for Sayard to come back and for us to meet Mr. Greco. When it was time, he came back and escorted us to Jose's dressing room. We entered. Jose was still in makeup, but he had taken off his costume and was wearing that blue terry cloth bathrobe that I had rescued from the trash. Sayard started to make the introductions. I don't think he got more than 2 or 3 words out of his mouth before Jose burst in with, "Hey, Eric, how did you like the show?" I thought it was great, especially that move you made with your lead dancer. Oh, her name is Nana. He went to the door and shouted, "Hey, Nana, ven aquí pronto. Quiero conocer a un amigo mío." Nana came in from the dressing room next door. She was even more beautiful up close. Jose rattled off something that my high school Spanish did not pick up. Nana gave me a big smile, a big hug, and I immediately fell in love with everything Spanish. When I turned around, I discovered a half a dozen or so more adults standing there like abandoned marionettes with their hands at their sides and their mouths wide open. "Oh, I met him earlier," I said, as if that were going to explain everything and satisfy everyone's curiosity. Jose came to my rescue. He told them the story of the bathrobe. I told them how I found it. Case closed, right? Not exactly. Jose was hungry. Because his costumes were so tight, he never ate before performance. He didn't want a distended stomach to ruin the line of his poses or the symmetry of his moves. However, Waterbury being Waterbury, at that time of night, the only place open was the White Tower Grill, a great spot for a great tasting greasy hamburger, but not exactly the spot anyone wanted to see Jose end up at. Then my father said, "Why don't you come out to our house? We only live a couple of minutes out of town. Eric and I would love to cook for you." I loved my old man, and if I hadn't, I would have loved him at that particular moment. Jose agreed, and from midnight until 6 a.m., Dad and I cooked bacon and eggs and whatever else we had on hand in the kitchen and fed Jose, Nana, and the rest of his troop. Jose regaled us with his on the road stories. Nana played with my mother's collie. The others sat around the table talking, and everyone talked. I understood one word in 10. Uh, it was an absolutely memorable night. So memorable, in fact, that I kept my mouth shut about it when I got back to school. I mean, why bother to tell them something they weren't going to believe in the first place? Anyway, life went on. Perhaps the only change for me was that I applied myself in Spanish class with a new vigor that surprised my Spanish teacher. Then, about 2 weeks later, at luncheon, my name echoed across the dining room loudspeaker. "Mr. Ruark, report to the dean's office immediately." Okay, now I was sweating. You don't get called to Mr. Oscarson's office at lunch unless you are in serious trouble. Oh, how could I be in trouble, you ask? Well, let me count the ways. No, perhaps I better not. Let's just say that I was not the perfect preppy and maintained a cache of embargoed commodities that would get me and other people suspended or expelled if the powers that be ever found them. Basically, cigarettes and beer. So, putting on the bravest face I could, I stepped away from the lunch table and walked down to Mr. Oscarson's office, and I knocked on the door. "Come in, Mr. Roark," he said. "How many weekend permissions do you still have?" "None," I answered. "I used the last one a couple of weeks ago." "Well, you do now," he said. You've lost me, sir. I just got a call from Jose Greco. Apparently, he wants to see you tonight in Springfield, Massachusetts. He was most insistent. I told him you were out of permissions, but he asked me to make a special exception for you. Lord knows why, but I agreed. I called your parents. They're picking you up at 4. Enjoy yourself." Now, Oski and I got along. We understood each other ever since the car incident. You see, at prep school, students weren't allowed to have cars on campus. I was a spoiled child. I make no bones about it. It was the way I was raised. In my own defense, I will say that I rarely asked for anything, and I didn't need to. My parents literally gave me things before I could open my mouth. When I turned 16, my parents bought me a car. It was a 1953 MG. It was old, but it ran well. Dad repainted it red. Top speed was around 65 miles an hour, but damn, it was a sweet little car. I kept it running until 1975 when I put it in storage for my honeymoon. And when I got back, rats had gotten into the storage area and had eaten the wooden frame and the leather seat belts and the leather seats, the wooden steering wheel. They started on the battery and the rubber hoses, but the battery acid killed them. The car was nothing more than a pile in the red metal in the middle of the concrete floor. Yes, it was insured, but anyway, Oski drove a green Jaguar sedan. I'd been home for a weekend, and for some reason which I no longer remember, my parents couldn't take me back to school. So I hopped into the MG and drove it back to Watertown. When I got to Taft, I parked my red MG directly behind Oski's green Jag. It took him a week to notice. And I wasn't even the worst offender. Impala Al was. He was legendary, and I didn't even get a nickname out of it. Well, Jose performed in Springfield and took my parents and me out to dinner. Great. The same thing happened when he performed in New Haven. He called the school. I got a get out of jail free card and had a great time. Then came New York City and the Carlisle. Whenever Jose was in New York City, he stayed at the Carlisle. Once again, we were invited to dinner. Only this time, there was a real crowd around Jose. Several people had come over from Spain, and Jose was showing them a good time in the Big Apple. He had me sitting next to this fellow named Andres. The man's whole face and body was a study in angles. Andres was a thin, muscular little man, especially dark skin, and it was made even darker by a deep, deep tan. Now, I was having trouble understanding him. He was speaking Spanish, but a Spanish I had never heard before. It was throaty and guttural. It was as if he were swallowing vowels and putting more consonants and emphasis on the consonants. I later learned that he was Andalusian and he was talking in the Andalusian dialect. Anyway, we were getting along pretty well when Andres suddenly turned to Jose and rattled off something. Jose nodded, buena idea. Then he turned to my father. Is it okay if I take Eric to Spain with me this summer? My father thought for a minute. I don't know. Eric, do you want to go to Spain? Sure, I said. Yes, it was just that easy. Not long after graduation, I found myself in Madrid. It was June. I was 18 years old, and I had my passport, some American Express checks, which I quickly converted to pesetas, and I was pretty much on my own. Jose had been delayed in the States. I had an introduction to his wife, Lola. She was his lead dancer in Around the World in 80 Days, and her Madrid phone number. I called. She was expecting me. The first thing she did was to take me to rent a car. We had a short journey to make to a small town to the north. Andres wanted to see me. Oh, didn't I mention it? Andres Vasquez. That was the ruggedly handsome man who came up with the idea of my going to Spain in the first place. He was the number 3 ranked matador in Spain at that time. Only El Cordobés and Paco Camino were ahead of him in the number of ears awarded. Andres was a major celebrity. There was a movie about him playing in the theaters across the Iberian Peninsula, and James A. Michener had devoted a whole chapter about him in his book, Iberia. Andres was fighting in a small venue in a little town an hour or so outside of Madrid. It was a rehab fight. He had been gored recently and had taken this little corrida to test the strength of the stitches holding his chest together. With matadors, there's no such thing as disabled list. If they got injured, they did not get any time off. They were contracted to perform at a certain place at a certain time, and once the posters had been printed, they performed whether they felt like it or not, or they had to forfeit their fee. Matadors, like A-listers of today, had a posse of people to support. They were called a cuadrilla. They included picadors, doublers, a doctor, and a whole slew of other people. Andres had been injured performing a stunt. As he explained it to me, when a bull charges, he charges with his feet under the center of gravity of his body. It's actually a position that pinches off his breathing a little, so that after a series of hard charges, when the bull wants a breather, he stops and stands with his feet slightly farther apart to open his chest cavity for deep breathing. The bull won't charge again until he brings his feet closer together. The movement is so subtle that most people in the arena don't notice it. It's when the bull is standing with his feet slightly apart that the matadors do all those tricks that excite the crowd. Andres was on his knees taunting the bull. His cape was behind him, stretched out in the sand. He had been watching the bull's movements and figured that he had the animal's timing down. The bull would charge several times hard, then rest with his feet apart. He'd then bring them together, pause a beat, then charge again. Andres planned to take the bull on his knees. Now, as the bull brought his feet together, Andres would start to swing the cape and figured that the cape would distract the bull at the last moment, allowing the horns to pass just under his chin. With the bull's attention fixed on the cape, the animal would duck his head around the matador's kneeling body and follow the cape as it passed behind the matador's head. That was the plan. Everything would have been perfect if the bull had pulled his feet together and charged. Only he didn't. He charged from the wide stance, throwing Andres' timing off. If he stood up, the bull would charge him, and not the cape. Franco Cardino had half his face ripped off when he stood up in front of a charging bull when trying this stunt in Sevilla in April of 1997. When the bull hit Andres, the horn raked across the front of his chest, ripping the costume from his shoulder to his shoulder and tearing into my friend's flesh like a chainsaw through soft wood. Several hundred stitches later, the wound was closed, only he had another fight coming up and needed to know if his damaged pectorals could stand the strain of the cape, the muleta, and the centrifugal forces necessary to keep the fabric between him and an angry 1,500-pound animal. This was a little local corrido with smaller, younger bulls. Andres dedicated one to me and gave me the blood-coated banderillas as a souvenir. The little bull proved to be a real test. Andres' damaged pecs were not healed enough to anchor the matador's movements. Andres let me sit in while his doctor restitched some of the ones that had pulled out. Afterwards, I suggested an ace bandage to hold his arm closer to his side to take the strain off the damaged muscles and allow his biceps to do all the work. It would be risky. It meant that he would have to keep his arm close to his body and that it would move the bull in closer too. Now, at the next full corrida, with his suit of lights on, the whole panoramic shebang, with his left arm secretly pinned to his side, Andres kept the bull so close that the animal's horns took nicks out of his shins. Now, with the bull's blood on his abdomen from his arm, from the animal's body rubbing against his, and with his own blood flowing down his legs, Andres had the crowd on its collective feet, cheering for him to be awarded 2 years or more. I spent that summer as part of Jose's extended family. He had 3 children with Lola. There was Pepe, Carmela, and Lolita. Through Lola, I met Juan Bandera, a well-respected artist who had a son my age, Juan Jr., who took me clubbing. A young teenage daughter, way too young for an 18-year-old like myself to be interested in, and a prodigy named Nona Bandera, who at the tender age of 10 had already recorded his first record and was fighting full-size bulls with the men. The matadors had to kill the animal for him because he was literally too small to reach over the horns with the sword. In fact, the sword was bigger than he was. Now, when I wasn't clubbing with Juan Jr., I was drinking scotch with his father. After a hard day's painting, Juan Sr. would like to head over to any number of little flamenco clubs that dotted Madrid and sit at a small table and drink scotch and water and smoke and just let the music wash over him. There was something, well, special about just sitting there with a bottle of White Horse and a pitcher of water between us, and the performers just a few feet away. Now, in the lulls, Juan Sr. and I would talk about art, life, and he would correct my Spanish when I said something wrong. It's a great way to learn. Now, at the end of June, Lola and the family moved down to the Torre del Greco, just outside of Marbella, in this little town of San Pedro de Alcantara. Right? I tagged along with them. The Torre was this wonderful hacienda-like complex with a servants' quarters, guest room, large backyard surrounded by an 8-foot hedge. There was a gate in the middle of the hedge, and when you opened the gate and took one step forward, you were standing on the sands of the Costa del Sol. The Mediterranean was only 20 or 30 yards straight ahead. Now, to the left in the distance, you could see the Marbella Club pool. To the right, jetting up over the horizon like a small stone in the middle of a blue sea, was the Rock of Gibraltar. From the Torre back gate, the rock looked about about half the size of my little finger's nail. Now, life was tough. I spent my days either perfecting my tan out on the incredible on the Mediterranean beach or traveling from Malaga to La Línea, following the matadors whom Andres had introduced me to. Nights when I wasn't escorting Lola to the various flamenco clubs that dotted the region, I divided my time between Mercedes' place in San Pedro, a little go-go club type bar where Tina danced, and the British bar near the Plaza de Toros where Victoria tended bar. Now, I would also spend time at the bar run by the Big Irishman on the main street in Marbella, and Pepe Moreno's discotheque located across the street from the Don Pepe and Skull hotels, out on the way a little bit out of town. Marbella at the time was not so sleepy little city located about halfway between Malaga and Gibraltar. It had not yet been discovered. They hadn't dredged the harbor, so the big multi-million-dollar yachts were still parking themselves up the coast in Torremolinos. But that didn't stop a lot of well-known personalities from hitting the surrounding beaches. The hottest place in Marbella was Pepe Moreno's discotheque bar restaurant. Unlike other bars, Pepe's was open all night, and anyone who was anyone usually showed up there. Except for the night that Brian Jones, the Rolling Stones, who committed suicide in '69, he decided to party at Mercedes and needed a ride back up to Malaga. I gave him one, and on the ride heard all about Mick Jagger's marijuana problems back in London. Pepe's was the place to hang after all the other clubs had closed. On this one particular evening, I had just seen a corrida featuring Jaime Ostos, who I personally considered to be the best bullfighter in all Spain. Now, Andres may have been my mentor, but there was something electric about the way Jaime Ostos handled the cape and muleta. Now, after the corrida, I headed over to the British bar to flirt with Victoria. Oh, did I mention she was blonde and beautiful and had the most exotic British accent I had ever heard? Okay, she was blonde and beautiful, and I was momentarily infatuated. Now, when the bar closed, I took Vicky to Pepe's to meet with the rest of the gang. There was a large group of us that hung out together on a regular basis after all the other bars had closed. Mercedes and Paquito, who were bar owners and had their own posses. Then there was Tina, Juan, Vicky, and me, and I dropped Vicky off at the table with the rest of the crew, and I went over to the bar to get us both a drink. While I was waiting for my order, George Hamilton stepped up beside me. Yeah, George Hamilton. This was 1967. There was no mistaking George Hamilton. He was 28 years old and a world famous actor who was dating Linda Bird Johnson, the daughter of the President of the United States. There wasn't a newspaper or a tabloid that he hadn't been featured in. He was dressed all in black, black shirt, black pants, black belt, black socks, black shoes, and his hair was perfect. I was impressed, and for the lack of anything better to do, I nodded to him. He nodded back to me and said, "That is one incredibly beautiful woman you came in with." Oh, did I mention that Victoria was incredibly beautiful? George Hamilton was talking to me. I had just spent the summer hanging with some of the most famous people on the Iberian Peninsula, and now I was standing at the bar in Pepe Moreno's with one of the most recognizable men in the world talking to me. I took a sip of my drink and tried to be James Bond cool about it. "Yeah, she is," I said, "isn't she?" And he said, "Are you two an item?" I said, "No, we're just friends. She's English and runs the bar over by the Plaza de Toros." "Oh, then you wouldn't mind if I asked her to dance?" he asked. I said, "No." Okay, well, okay, what would you have done? I mean, I was no slouch, considered myself good looking. I just come off a season of playing lacrosse at my prep school, and I could fit into Harry Belafonte's clothes. Harry Belafonte had recently stayed at the Torre as Jose's guest and had left a trunk of his Calypso clothes behind. And praise God, he and I were the same size. I knew I looked buff, but I was no George Hamilton, and I caved. "Oh, hell no, I'll introduce you," I said. Picking up the drinks, but then I stopped and turned to George and I said, "Aren't you supposed to be dating someone kind of on the serious side?" I was referring to Linda Bird Johnson. George looked at me and smiled. "Oh, I gave up bird watching a couple of weeks ago," he said in a slightly conspiratorial tone. Now, at that moment, I was an incredibly rich man. I was sitting on the scoop of the century, well, decade at least. This was a story of mega proportions. The National Enquirer was offering $40,1967 for something of this magnitude. George Hamilton had just told me that he had broken up with the President of the United States' daughter. This was front page tabloid material in every country in the world. If I had a cell phone, I would have been driving a Porsche by noon. But cell phones were still 40 years in the future, and I wasn't interested in the money. However, I was interested in something. I turned to George and said, "I'd be happy to introduce you. Just do me a favor." "Sure, what?" he said. I said, "Pretend you know me." "No problem. What's your name?" George and I walked back over to the table. I put the drink down in front of Victoria and said, "Hey, Vicky, just ran into a friend of mine, and he wants to dance with you." Everyone looked up and froze. I had seen that look before back in Waterbury, Connecticut. Everyone was sitting there with their mouths open. George put on a Golden Globe winning performance. We'd been old friends for God knows how long, and he was just as surprised as hell to run into me here in Pepe's of all places. When we had them hooked, line, and sinker, he asked Victoria to dance. And that was the last I saw of them. Now, really, it was the tail end of August, and I had to get back to America to do my freshman year at Rutgers University. I was long gone before Vicky ever got back from wherever George and she disappeared to. Now, back home, when I told everyone what had happened, no one believed me. I didn't think they would. Then, when the story broke in the National Enquirer, I've often wondered who got the $40,000 for my scoop. Fate, time, and death have scattered everyone to the four winds. Jose died in the early 90s. Then, last check, Andres was in his 80s and breeding fighting bulls somewhere in Spain. I have no idea what happened to Mercedes, Paquito, and their crews, or Tina and Victoria. And every now and again, I see George Hamilton on TV or in the movies. I do have a fantasy, though. One day I would like to attend something that George Hamilton is performing in and stand outside for an autograph. And as he's signing my playbill, I want to lean in and ask, where in the hell did you and take Vicky? I never got a final drink at that little club she ran, just to see what his reaction would be.